Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space, Patreon. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and as always, I'm joined by Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing? You okay?
I'm doing fine. I have no clever clip here.
No, well, it's let's say what we're doing. We're basically rounding up. We're finishing off a franchise with a Patreon thing. We've done all the others. We're doing Quatermass, one of my favourites. We're actually going to be doing Quatermass. We did the Quatermass Experiment, we did Quatermass 2, and Quatermass and the Pit, which is my favourite. Now we are doing the Quatermass Conclusion, which came a little later, feels a little different, and has a different tone to it. But it's also got a bit of a history. This is obviously, the story is in some point in the near future. It was released in 1979, but at some point in the near future, Britain's fallen into disarray, and gangs have started to take over parts of urban areas, specifically in London. Our hero, Bernard Quatermass, is called from his Scottish cottage against a lock, sounds lovely, down to London to appear on a TV show to talk about a new space. Two shuttles, one Russian, one American, coming together to form a space station in space. And whilst he's there, he says how disgusted he is by it and uses it to try and look for his missing granddaughter. Unfortunately, things go wrong. The spacecraft starts to fall apart. And shortly afterwards, we find that there is a bigger issue. He meets a guy called Dr. Joe Clapp. And when introduced to his family, they talk about the standing stones and all these other folkloric bits. And by the end of the first episode, which we'll talk about how this is different to the series and the film, we find that a beam is coming from space and is either taking up groups of youth called planet people, or is turning them to ash and taking some form of their essence. And we then have to rely on Bernard Quatermass to solve the problem and stop the beams.
Well, and the planet people are like a youth cult that's, wandering through the countryside, very hippie-esque, infecting more and more people. They're sort of remarkably anti-science, anti-reason, amidst society's kind of collapse.
Yes. Yeah, the planet people. They were modeled very roughly on Heaven's Gate and several other UFO cults of the 70s. And that this fact that in Britain in particular, there had been this resurgence of back to the land, folkloric occultism and sort of mysticism. Wicca was taking hold and all this other stuff. And let's be clear, Nigel Neal, who the creator of, was getting on in years at this point.
Yes, you can tell.
And is kind of annoyed about a lot of things. This is an angry old man shaking his fist at young people and the way the world's gone. It's not the same as it was in my day, kind of show.
The streets are filled with crime, society's come unglued, and those young people are different and scary, and they have dumb ideas, don't they?
Yeah, yeah, very much. I mean, this is. If this could be a conservative advert, a Tory advert, it would be. Yeah, it's interesting though. I mean, I think this is interesting because this is a different. I should say, Nigel Neal was never entirely satisfied with this, either the TV series or the film. He didn't particularly like John Mills as this version of Bernard Quatermass. He actually wanted Andrew Keir to come back, but was getting older and didn't want to do it. And he feels that this is too much of a sort of a softly Bernard Quatermass.
Grandfatherly, sort of nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and also, although it has higher production values because they always intended to have it as a film,
Mhm.
um, it still didn't meet what he had envisioned in his head. Um, and I think that sort of is evident in several key elements to this sort of to the film.
Well, before we begin, I have to kind of call you out, right? So, this is a Patreon side episode to our post-apocalyptic block.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a post-apocalyptic movie, or do you just love Quatermass? And so it's close enough if you squint.
It is. It has post-apocalyptic elements, and I feel it's sort of like. Let me put it this way: this is a Tory's version of a post-apocalyptic event. Now, there's actually
Those immigrants.
yeah. When this was discussed, in the sort of the the late 70s, early 80s, when this was broadcast, the 4-part mini series in particular, which has some variances, but not as much as I thought actually it would do. It was referred to as, they coined the phrase, a comfy catastrophe, which is the world has come to an end, but everyone's kind of okay with it, and they're sort of carrying on. Um, and this was I think one of Neil's complaints is it never feels as messed up as it should do. It feels more so in the show introduces more elements that allow you to realize that the whole world has gone to seed. The film cuts out certain things. So no, I agree. The film is less post-apocalyptic, but the TV series definitely has more of that in.
Yeah, and I mean it's sort of a sort of social apocalypse, right? And
Yes.
it's funny you say it's a sort of Tory vision. It is a very sort of like Trumpian version of like,
Yeah.
well, we tolerated those liberals, we let immigrants come into the country, and now the streets are filled with MS-13, and those people are robbing stores blind. They're going out of business from all of the crime. The streets are filled with homeless people. The homeless thing is kind of true, but I mean, all of the rest is wildly exaggerated. But also, I mean, this is not. This is the sort of era a few years before, the famous sort of New York go to hell headline, right?
Yeah.
Where crime did seem sort of out of control in the 70s. And then this wonderful thing happened, in this country as abortion rights came in, and then all those latchkey kids, weren't born and were instead born later to parents who wanted them. And it's amazing how crime dropped.
Mm.
This is actually a theory supported by some data. So, yeah, I mean, it is a sort of like slow apocalypse
Yeah.
as, law and order have fallen by the wayside, don't you know?
Well, yeah, well, that's it. But I think one of the things is the politics of this are kind of confused because Nigel Neal is very left leaning, which I think is more evident in his earlier sort of Quatermass sort of stories, and even some of his other stories. There was a series he did in the 70s called Beasts, which was a series of like horror stories. It's very sort of left leaning. But this was almost in response to well, no, it wasn't almost. It was in response to what he saw was coming, which was the landslide victory of Margaret Thatcher. And this film is very much, this is what's coming. This is what a Tory government is going to give you in the future. And I like the fact you have these things called bought cops. You have like cops that have been paid for, the contracted cops, and you have all these elements that come into it that he is like, yeah, like it's kind of, the big elements that are missing in the film. There's one in particular that's really interesting. To go through the plot, at one point they have a young girl who has been affected by the beam and she's been blinded and deaf and stuff, and they have to get her to London to be assessed and analysed. And when they get there, they get attacked by a bunch of gangs. In the film, they manage to get through the gangs, and both Bernard Quatermass and the woman he's with, Margaret, no,
Sort of
sorry,
barely get
Annie
through.
Morgan, yeah, get to the hospital. So in the TV show, Quatermass
He's
is
kidnapped.
he's kidnapped and taken
Yeah.
from the thing, and he ends up spending about an episode with a bunch of old people that live in a junkyard because they've all been thrown out their homes and left to their own devices, and so have formed this community under a bunch of cars. But they are looked after by one of the local gangs as long as they do things for the gang and stuff. So this kind of social degradation is much more played out in the TV show. And in my opinion, I think the TV show is much more impactful, and it actually sort of has there's a whole like an expanse of time and other things as well. Um, the other element of this to throw in is Neil's kind of frustration with this new agey crap that was coming in. Like he'd hated it since the 60s, really wasn't a fan, thought it was he's obviously this is a man of science. Nigel Neal is very much a man of science. He came from I believe the Isle of Man. He came from the Isle of either the Isle of Man or the Isle of Wight, I forget. But where he came from was filled with like superstition. It was very sort of like oldie worldy, and he moved away from all that. Like whenever he's done those folky things, there's some of it in Beasts. It's always about how sort of like silly it is, and sort of like don't be attached to the old worldy kind of things. And so the planet people and all that is very much in that nature of like, look at these ridiculous ideas, of being magic and all this other stuff. But I like the fact that you meet Joe Cap, this doctor, this Jewish doctor, and he talks about his Jewish heritage and stuff, which I find is kind of interesting. And he's a man of science, and he poo-poos this idea of magic and all sort of thing. But when it all starts to go wrong throughout the story, one of the things that Neil highlights in this is how we as a people will always fall back to ritual and ideas. And with Joe, for example, he loses his family in quite it's kind of brutal. It's more brutal again in the show than it is in the film. You've seen his wife with the menorah, like with the candles, and she's done the ritual, and he's like, oh, well, we've kind of like, I've got to let her do it. It's a bit of a family thing. But when he loses his family, he does it. Like it's his thing. He falls back into this idea of ritual. So there is this idea from Neil that we're all kind of silly, and we're always going to fall back into like worshipping some sky god because we're not smart enough not to. And so I do feel there's a real bitterness and frustration in this film.
No, I think that's true, and I think that's fair, right? I mean, people get scared and they retreat into not really tradition, right? They retreat into a kind of modified version of tradition, right? Because let's be clear, none of these traditions are really ancient. No. If a first century Christian met either of our country's religious rites, they would be utterly appalled at what Christianity has become. And, I think you're right that this doesn't feel like, and I was joking about the Trump stuff, but this doesn't feel like an angry reactionary person on the whole, right? I mean, because, while it's not presented as a truth, we do see the menorah, and we see this, Jewish Seder. And, I mean, my only objection to that is that, this is the same person who said, yes, and they are violent against reason, which, sounds over the top and angry, but I don't disagree. And, look, I mean, I sort of feel like, I like the ideas of peace and love, but then you start talking about like, love is all you need, and we need to send positive vibes out into the universe, and conspiracy theories, and all of this nonsense, and I think, okay, you're just an irrational person. I live in a world of science too. I don't want any part of this. So I mean, obviously there were good things about the hippie movement, but there was also a lot of mumbo jumbo. So I understand that take. I don't think it's mean. I do kind of find myself thinking, right, you see that menorah, that's just as crazy, right? Like, that's just as crazy. It's just
but that's his point. Yeah, that I
right.
think that's sort of what Nigel Neal is getting to, but I think it's sort of like I mean, I think he identifies Joe as a hypocrite, you know, a little bit. I think this is, I think, something that I think the show, when you look at the TV series, is becomes a bit more evident. Because he talks about, his kids and this other things. I think one of the things that the TV show does, apart from spending time with the old people in the cars, you end up spending more time with the characters, and especially Joe's family before the tragedy.
Mhm.
And you get to spend. Did you manage to watch the show, or did you just watch the film? I don't know.
I watched the film.
Okay,
I, I,
yeah.
I had trouble tracking it down, but eventually I managed to track it down.
Oh, well done. Yeah, yeah. But so there's a character in the you see her in the film as well. When they go to Joe's place, he's got this observatory with the cat dish and the dog dish, these big satellite dishes that they're using, sort of like radio telescopes they're using to monitor outer space. And he's got these three other scientists working with him. This big sort of beardy guy, this sort of, I think it's sort of Chinese guy, and then this woman, who's a very young woman who has come in to be a part of this team, um, Alison. And what you notice is in the TV show, when he comes in, they joke about the fact that he always sort of brings a present back for his kids, but he doesn't, because he always forgets, and it's always Alison that has, oh, here's something we've got, or here's one for you, and she's created a corn dolly, which is a little figurine, obviously, strawn together, made out of corn or corn sticks and that sort of thing. And she makes a couple of other references, and so she has this almost like this folky kind of connection, but she's also the youngest of the group, and she spends a lot of time with the kids, and she babysits the kids, and there's all these other connections and stuff. And she actually disappears and joins the planet people. And so it's kind of impactful where you're like, oh, like you can be completely logical on this other stuff, but like it can still
In fact,
infect you, like wheedle its way into you. And that's exactly the sort of the idea, is this idea that, oh, actually, like it can infect you. And she ends up getting zapped, I think, in the second laser beam when it comes down. But the other character you spend a lot of time with in the TV show, which makes things more impactful, is Joe's wife, Claire. So you find out she's an archaeologist, and she's sort of, you see in the film she's dug up this beaker, and she talks about the beaker people, and she
she
was
talks
one,
about the archaeology and wanting to have more time to dig up the stones and stuff like that.
and she has a connection with the earth and all this other stuff. And so one of the things that she does that you don't see in the film, after the first beam, and they save that small child, Isabel, I think they call her. Claire starts taking care of her and starts almost to become sort of like much more motherly towards her, and she starts to sort of like, you see it in the film as well, when the girl gets excited, she's like, lay, which we'll talk about in a minute. She sort of repeats it back to her, and she says to Joe, I'm just doing it to calm her down. Like, don't read too much into it. I'm just doing it to calm her down. But there is more there, and in the TV show, you see that she starts to sort of like learn more a little bit, and so when they try to take Isabel, like she kicks up a massive fuss, and they've sort of like, they have to sort of like push her out of the way and get the child, and she's like, no, you can't take her. So she's also defended the planet people at several other points to let them walk through. So when the second group comes, she's more intrigued, and although she defends her children, she's actually interested in seeing what's going on, and so that's why they get closer to the group and why they end up getting killed. So again, you've got this thing of like, yes, you can be irrational, and you can be a rational person, but this mentality and this idea, I think this is what Nigel Neal's getting to, is when life is crap, like, and looking tough, sometimes these sort of new agey ways can feel like an easy way out of your problems, and it's quite easy for other people to fall into the trap of it, as they end up doing. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, but it's brutal when he gets back and finds like the dog's been incinerated and his family has just been obliterated. It's feels very Nigel Neal.
Yeah, all that stuff sounds good. I mean, some of that's in the movie, some
Mm,
of that comes through. I like these social issues. I like
mm,
the sort of discussion about religion. I like that kind of stuff. I like these sort of like attempt to preserve rationality in this little, place with the satellite dishes, while the world kind of falls apart. Um, but let's talk about a couple things that are not working here. One is Quatermass,
mm,
as the, old grandpa who has uh, no other concern except finding his granddaughter.
mm,
Who is his granddaughter? What happened to his children? Like none of this is important. He's just, a grandfather who wants to find his granddaughter. And he goes on TV and basically rants about how we should not cooperate with the Soviet Union.
oh
The
yeah,
Yanks shouldn't, and we're a small country and, we're going to get lost in the shuffle, which is, I mean, it's fine. It is what it is. But then he holds the photo of his granddaughter up and then he's like, this is all I care about anyway. So, I have a question about sort of what is the continuity? Because like in Quatermass in the Pit, which is by far the best of the
mm,
four, um, and which I kept thinking of during this, and like I want this to be that, and
yeah,
it's not. Um, you know, there is a sort of apocalyptic event,
mm,
at least for part of the UK. So that's never mentioned in this. And the Quatermass of sort of Quatermass 2, who's a rocket scientist and a very egotistical sort of aristocratic kind of scientist figure. He's just a broken down old grandpa now.
yeah,
And that seems like the least interesting thing you can do with that character. If you're going to do that, at least have him talk about the good old days and be much more broken down than he really is. Um, so that's number one. And
mm,
number two is you say the budget is increased, they got more budget to make the movie. It looks cheap at every
yes,
level.
it does.
It really just looks like a TV movie from the 70s or something.
Which is exactly what it is, and you are 100% right. I mean, it was made by a TV production company called Thames TV. The other thing we should highlight from this is the BBC didn't want to make this.
Mhm.
Neil had brought it to them, and they said, "Nope, not interested." It's been over a decade since, well, it's been several decades since they'd been involved.
Well, they
Um,
took the option, right? They
mm,
started. I think they started some work, but they were like, "This is going to be too expensive." Is
yeah,
what I read. Yeah.
but the two issues that they had was obviously the budget, but also it was called, well, as far as it ends. Let's be clear about. Let's where this ends. It's called the conclusion for a reason. Like, and I want to talk.
Yeah.
We'll talk about the ending of. I don't like the ending of this.
No,
Um,
it's not good.
but
But
um,
it's dark,
but it's dark. It
which
is. It
yeah.
is, which is good. But the key of it is it was the last one. So I think there's a part of the BBC that were going like, well, why would we do this? Like it's been 30, it's been 20 years or more since we did, the last ones, the Quatermass 1, 2, and Quatermass in the Pit. Why would we go back to this? So Thames TV made it, sold it to ITV. ITV gave them the money, and then with the explicit intent of saying we're going to sell this out as a movie abroad, so we're going to give you more money. And so Nigel Neal, I think skillfully does a great job
Mhm.
of writing it so that there is a four-part TV series that runs for about 3.5 hours, and then there is a film version, which is the Quatermass Conclusion, which runs for about an hour and 50 minutes. And he scripted them both. But both feel good, but what's removed doesn't impact the plot, but definitely impacts to me the grounding and the content and also the time scale of some of this as well. But the other thing is like who's going to watch this when the last film made by Hammer was 67, so it's over a decade ago. And also, it's a little bit like releasing a film now, which you can do. I suppose this would be like a legacy sequel where you're going to go, oh, we're going to do a sequel with, it's the last one. Who the hell's going to watch a film called The Conclusion if you can't even remember what
Yeah.
happened to the previous films? Like, it's a bizarre marketing
But also, it has
choice.
no connection to the previous films,
And this is
right?
the
I
other
mean,
thing. Yeah, this is the thing I wanted to mention. You're right. And I'd forgotten. I watched this when I first picked this up in 2015, 7, something like that on Blu-ray, and I hadn't watched it for a while. I was in my head. I was convinced that the degradation, the collapse, was all linked to the events of Quatermass in the Pit.
Quatermass in the Pit. Yeah.
That like, oh,
And
we
I
thought,
expected that.
yeah, and I thought he
Yeah.
was going to say it because there's several moments where he's like, well, what has caused this craziness? And I was like, could it be our Martian genes? I don't know. Like, could it be, something like that? Maybe. Um, so yeah, but this never gets mentioned. Like, it's almost like because we've moved forward in time with our knowledge, and I think that's a key part of this. We've landed on the moon. We've done further exploration of space. And Joe Cap even says, because the planet people want to go off to a different planet, they think they're going to get, heaven gated off to another planet, behind Hale-Bopp comet. And he says, where in our solar system are you going to go that you don't either freeze to death or burn to a crisp? And then that's when you're going like, oh yeah, so the Martian thing of Quatermass in the Pit is now considered silly. So we don't really want to acknowledge that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this does not make sense to me. This lack
No.
of continuity doesn't make sense. Why reuse Quatermass if you're not going to have that continuity? Especially if you're going to turn him into a grumpy grandfather who is looking for his granddaughter. I mean, that could be anybody, right? It doesn't have to be
Mm.
Quatermass. I mean, this is the least interesting version of Quatermass
Mm.
out of the 4 films, and it's that would at least be interesting if he were bitter, like in my day I was a rocket scientist, and I was there, I discovered the Martian gene thing. I've seen Apocalypse, I've seen Rough Times, right? If you're not going to do that, he's just a grumpy old man looking for his granddaughter.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling.
No, you talk about the continuity. We know he has a daughter because in the first series and the first film, his daughter works with him. I think she's mentioned in Quatermass 2, Barbara. So there's that, and in this there's such a drop line of like, they were in Germany and they were my daughter and her husband were killed on the autobahn. You're like, all right, that's that solved. Move on. Like it's kind of like perfunctory.
What was his
But
relationship to this missing
yeah,
granddaughter? I mean, we don't know.
well that's
It's
it.
just a plot device.
Yeah, it is. I don't know how long he looked after her. If like they have a connection, she's only 16. It all feels again. It's a plot device, isn't it? It feels very much like this is the reason he's come to London, and we have to have a reason for him to leave Scotland to come to this. This is it, and that's it. That's all it serves. Yeah, it is kind of poor. It also leads up to a incredibly frustrating final scene,
Yeah.
which we'll get
Well,
to.
let's talk about this technology, right?
Mm.
I mean, because every time technology is used in this, it makes no sense and is not interesting. So you have these radar dishes, the dog dish and the cat dish, and they're
Mm.
detecting this kind of signal from space. Interesting. That's like, the 3-body problem. Like, this is the wow signal, like, okay, I get it. Except it's not, it's just the side effect of this beam. Now, I like the idea of the humans thinking that the beam is taking them into space and is actually disintegrating them. That's cool, right?
Mm.
This sort of, is it or is it not? And it's clear to Quatermass and the other scientists, they're just dead, right? But I don't understand why the survivor is lifted up poltergeist style.
Yeah,
How does that
and then
happen?
and then explodes.
And then explodes. Why? I mean, if they're extracting, from the beam, this makes no sense. I mean, it makes for a dramatic scene, but it makes no sense. I mean, that's sort of mind-bogglingly stupid.
And never addressed. I should say, like that scene happens, and no one, Quatermass or anybody, ever mentions it again, not only in the film or in the TV show. It just sort of happens, and everyone goes, "Well, that was just weird," and then moves on.
Guess we won't be examining her,
Yeah.
right? That's basically the point, right?
Mm.
And I mean, so what is the white kind of like salt like stuff that's left after the beam hits? What is that made of? Nobody ever analyzes it. Nobody ever tells us, at least in the movie version. um and then what we're left to believe is that aliens have 5,000 years ago visited Earth. So it's another sort of like Quatermass in the pit, like
Hmm.
there's alien connections to Earth that we didn't know, right? Except incommensurate with what we learned at
Yeah.
Quatermass in the pit. So 5,000 years ago, aliens visited Earth and they put in the Earth these receptors underneath the ground. And in some cases, monuments like Stonehenge were built around them. In other cases, that's been forgotten. We don't know totally why humans did that. Maybe to commemorate the dead or the people who were zapped away.
At one point they're like, "Oh, it's a warning. These are bad places." That's yeah.
And this is kind of connected to like the hippies, the planet people's idea of ley lines. It's not called
Hmm.
that, although they say ley.
Which is
Um,
what they're doing. They're following straight ley lines. They are.
Yeah.
That's exactly what they're
Except
supposed to be doing.
ley lines don't really exist, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but at least this is like some justification for that supernatural belief,
Hmm.
right?
Mm.
So, okay, that's kind of cool, right? Except the aliens' real plan in visiting Earth and depositing these receptors around the world is so that they can zap humans and harvest young humans' protein.
Well, no, we don't know that. That's the thing. That's the thing. That's the speculation. So in both the film and the TV show, you have like Bernard. So you have Quatermass and his Russian sort of counterpart, Gurov. They have this conversation where they're going like, "Well, I think it's harvesting," and and even they're like, "Well, we're
Mhm.
not sure. We don't know what this is actually doing. Like, is it because Quatermass has this great moment where he's like, maybe a flavor for some like luxurious space
Dish.
people. Like we don't
Yeah.
know what this is actually doing. Like we have no idea. So it never actually tells us like what this actually is for or what it is,
But
why or
but
why
the
now.
Yeah, I mean, and you and I are both comfortable with that kind of ambiguity,
Oh,
but
I
this feels a
prefer it. Yeah, yeah,
little too ambiguous to me.
yeah.
I mean, we're also said like they speculate that this beam is coming from 1,000 light years away,
Mm.
right? So aliens 1,000 light years away visited Earth, deposit these receptors, and this is the simplest way to get a seasoning. I mean, you know,
Don't know.
what
Yeah,
in the
it
world
needs to
is that?
have you,
It's
but
so ambiguous. Like I can't imagine a solution to this that
no.
makes sense.
And I agree. This is something you need, isn't it? You need to at least have um you need to have an answer that kind of makes sense, or at least alternatives. You need to be able to say, well, it does
Hmm.
this and this. And one of the things that you highlight, which really bothers me in this, because this isn't like old, this is, late 70s, this was made. Like, this was made in 79.
There are
The,
20-year-olds listening to this podcast going like, the
yeah,
year 2000 is old.
yeah.
Okay, what
All right, technologically, let me put it this way. Scientifically, technologically, like this is still 1979. No one takes a sample of that powder, as you say, that is
Mhm.
left and says, let's analyze it and see what is in there. Because I'm pretty sure there'd be, if I was writing this, there'd be a scene where they analyze it and be like, I can determine these are human proteins, this is what's missing.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then you go, okay, cool, that makes sense. This is a heat beam, it does this, or it's doing something, it's extracting water, it's extracting, I don't know, some kind of essence of us. It needs to have that speculation, and you're right, it doesn't.
Well, part of my problem with this is like it's like the problem with the Matrix, right? Like if you want to make batteries, there are way more efficient ways of doing it than using human
Yeah.
beings, right? Like, if what you want is organic protein, why do you want young
Mm.
people and why do you want people? Like, they're stampeding, they're like, gazelle herds and stuff, you can target. I mean, and you can generate proteins in a lab,
Mm.
like I can't imagine what the answer to
No,
this is.
this whole thing needs to change. to really work. Because the other thing as well is we don't, at no point do we understand why the young are being attracted to these places. They're saying like there's something calling them here. They're being sort of brought, and then it's a congregation. I mean, the biggest one being Wembley Stadium, in later in the film, but no one explains why. Like no one sort of says the thing because it gets weirder. That when they try to the end of the film is that they are going to instigate a beam. So they kind of figure out that they are triggered by it waits for a certain amount of people to get there and then it will trigger the beam. Okay, so you need to bait the hook and then the beam will come and they're going to let off a 35 megaton nuclear weapon in the English countryside to teach the lesson.
So insane.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, so I have to stop you and ask two questions, right? Number one is if it's true, I mean, they're going to simulate the scent of 1 million humans.
Right.
I don't know how you're doing that. I don't, there are.
It gets weirder. I want to tell you about that. I'm going to explain that in a second. But go on, second question.
Okay, so I mean, I've got a number of questions. I'm not even on the first. The first question is, if it waits till a number of people are there, why did it strike the scientist's home?
Because it didn't. There was a group of people in the Stumpy Stones. They were too close.
How many people though?
Oh, it's about 70. It's not a big group.
Okay.
Compared to others.
So you don't need 70,000 people.
No.
Or 1 million people to attract. I mean, I know that's to really bait the hook, but it seems like these aliens are willing to to disintegrate really small numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, so go ahead with the pheromones and the scent thing.
Right.
How does?
Oh, it doesn't work. It's stupid, and I want to explain how much more stupid it is in the series. So one of the reasons that Quatermass gets kidnapped, taken by the old people and stuff, and he spends time with them, is you get to see how the gangs work, and you learn much more about the gang, the Blue Brigade and the Red Brigade, and all these gangs.
The Reds and the Blues.
Yeah, literally.
When you're red, you're red. Oh.
Yeah, it's all kinds of Crips and Bloods. But one of the things he meets a scientist there, and they say, "Oh, we've got a scientist, Mr. Crimshaw or whatever it's called." And so they talk, but you find out that he worked for a soap company creating the scents of cleaning products. And so Quatermass is like, "Oh, well, you're of no real use to me," and so leaves. And then they come back later and they're like, "We need someone who can harvest the smell." So they're like, "But they need to be old." And they're like, "Aha, I have this old scientist person living in the back of a car in the junkyard. We'll go get him." And you see him very briefly in the film. He's smelling a vial of something during the end montage. But yeah, he's like a key character, like for a whole part where he's explaining about how they could do, we need to have the scent and you can combine this and you can make these artificial smells and da 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 da. So it makes no more sense.
It doesn't work that way, right?
No,
companies take years to develop a scent that human noses is imitating like lilac or whatever, right?
Exactly.
The complex scent of a human. How do you know what is the thing that's attracting them out of everything? I mean,
so they call everything, don't they? Because they talk about using body heat, sound, the scent, and all this other stuff, and it feels a little bit desperate. And this is probably some of Neil's worst writing, I think, where it's sort of like this feels really kind of loose and messy, but it is what it is.
So my second question after the scent one, or after the scent and the aren't they blasting small numbers anyway?
Mm-hmm.
My second question is, how the fuck is this atomic bomb going to work? I mean, you have to assume they don't really. You pointed out they don't really know if people are being harvested.
Nope.
How are you harvesting? Are you harvesting the air? Are you punching a hole through the atmosphere? So you're going to harvest the blast as it happens?
Yeah.
And then
so basically, the idea is
fallout?
No. The fallout bit never gets addressed. But the idea is that by letting off a bomb, so their expectation is that this beam is a two-way passage, right? So it's a heat beam, but it's clearly extracting something from these kids. So if it's extracting something, it means it's a two-way channel. So what we're
Right.
going to do is we're going to sting it by letting off this 35 megaton bomb by the moment it hits, and so it will the blast will pass up the beam to whatever's at the
Mhm.
other end. That's the idea.
Assuming it's a teleporter, right?
Yes.
That leaves, right. Except that's not in evidence, right?
No.
It's clearly not taking everything, right? It's not taking those rocks,
Mm.
right? If it's not taking those rocks
It
and the
incinerates
grass,
everything. Yeah.
but those rocks are still there. It's not
Mhm.
like it turns the ground into a Star Trek teleporter pad and teleports everything up and just leaves this salty like signature. Why would you assume that, the molecules of an atomic explosion will be taken up by this? And
No idea.
secondly, even if they were, this is like these people, if you believe these people are being disintegrated and it's taking the proteins, right?
Hmm.
It's not going directly into the mouths of aliens as seasoning, right?
No.
Like there's like a receptacle that's like, oh, well, got a lot of nuclear waste in this one. Maybe don't use that. Why would you assume this would hurt them? I mean,
It makes it's I don't know. The ending of this makes no sense to me. It is the worst ending of all of the Quatermass stories. Um, and you're right. It makes no sense. I'm not even sure how far away. Like, so they leave Quatermass and Cap to let like to um set off the nuclear weapon when the time comes. And the idea is that it should only be those two there when the beam comes because they've manufactured it. But a bunch of other planet people turn up and so on and so forth. But you've also got these like this general, and you've got Gerov and these other people. And I'm like, how far away are you that when we set off this nuclear bomb, you're not going to get hurt? Because you kind of look like you're 2 fields away, and I'm not sure that's enough. So yeah,
there's
I'm
not a
gonna,
lot of discussion of people saying, wait a minute, you intend to detonate a bomb in the English countryside?
yeah, not even mentioned in the series either. Like, there's never any stopping point. It's ridiculous.
It's
Um,
just like at this point, they're just like, yeah, you do you, Quatermass. You want an atomic bomb, we'll give you an atomic bomb.
yeah. Um,
Okay.
the other thing I want to it's worth mentioning about the end. No, there is. So you've said about his granddaughter, who he has his
Mm-hmm.
photograph, and he talks about it endlessly. Every person he sees, he gives them a photograph, or he'll talk about her, and blah blah blah. Right, so on and so forth. And throughout the film, and it happens in it's what's this works better in the film than it does in the series because it's closer together. So throughout the film, you get these shots, and you see that his granddaughter is with the planet people, and she has missed being zapped. So she's wandering the countryside, lay, and you keep seeing her, and they almost cross paths, like they literally cross paths on several occasions, but they just don't see each other. They do the same thing in the TV show, but it's every episode. So there's all this other stuff going on, and then all of a sudden you see his granddaughter, and you're like, oh yeah, she's there. Like, it's not close enough together to have the impact that it does in the film. Um, anyway, she then does appear at the end. No words are spoken between them. I just want to highlight. They have this sort of eye contact, and Joe has been incapacitated, which we'll talk about in a second. But then she goes up, and despite the fact that she has been with the planet people for God knows how long, she understands what her grandfather's trying to do, who's out of nowhere had a heart attack, which is
Has he
never
had a
been.
heart attack?
Well, he grabs his chest and sort of falls to the floor, and he struggles to get up the steps. And I'm like, well,
God.
that's not been a factor in the
He's
show
not had any heart trouble,
at all.
until
Like,
now.
yeah, so that comes out of nowhere. But then she helps him, and she helps him launch the nuclear bomb. And I'm like, and no words are spoken. And you're like, eh? What? Why is she doing that? Like, how's that come
Yeah,
about?
she
Like,
comes
what's?
into the room and they have this moment, and it the cool thing is it's kind of like Quatermass didn't expect the planet people to be there, so he is well aware he's killing these people, although
Mm,
a bunch of them were going to die anyway. I
yeah.
mean, so, but now he knows he's killing not just himself but also his daughter, right?
His
And so he
granddaughter,
has to
yeah.
make this decision for the greater good. Except again, it's super weird. Why does she show up at the end? Why does she break through and, break through the spell of the planet people to kind of help him? Why does she help push the button? I mean, that seems like a bridge. It's far enough that it's bad enough that she would fight the,
Yeah.
hypnotic control, right? To then also help push the button if she knows what it is. I mean, this
Yeah,
is,
all
and
this.
then it fades white.
Yes,
Awesome special effect there, by the way.
yes. Which is the beam and the bomb going off all in one blast. And it works apparently because there's no more beams coming. Whatever, you have this sort of monologue of Gurov gives this sort of voiceover at the end to say it all worked out fine, and now the children can sing huffity puffity whatever. One of the other things that's kind of different when there is different between the series and the film is the planet people. So the planet people of the film, you get a sort of a grasp of them. They're very sort of like hippie-ish, as you sort of said. They've got the thing, and they're going lay, following the ley lines. But there's this kind of leader figure that pops up every now and then. A guy called Kick Along, and he at one point, he's sort of like in Mad Max. The way they talk is so irritating. It's so sort of faux or pre-Mad Max Thunderdome kind of broken English. Um, you know, there's one point where stop learning stuff is one of the lines. And you're just like, what? um,
You think you know, but you
yeah,
don't know.
you don't know. Stop learning things.
Yeah.
But this guy Kick Along he's their leader. Or he becomes their leader. Like at one point when Quatermass tries to warn them to run, he takes over the megaphone and gets shot at and all this other stuff and becomes this kind of like cult leader, and gets raised up to this position. In the film, like he pops up every now and then and that's it, right? And then he's there at the end and dies in the final blast. He kills Cap. He kills Joe Cap with a machine gun at the end. But what you don't realize in the TV show, he becomes the leader of a group of planet people that become increasingly violent. And that's more interesting. So they go off, and because they get sort of shooed away from the farm and the observatory, they go off and they try to take over a farm, and they literally kill a farmer to take his farm. And then you have these moments of seeing that like Kick Along and his group are much closer to the group, the gangs in London, the Blue Brigade and so on and so forth. So there's these sort of like harmless planet people that are wandering the countryside. And then there's Kick Along, who is becoming this sort of cult leader. And although he's taking people to their inevitable death with the beam, he's still reveling in the power of being this cult leader. So you see him being sort of like carried around on the back of a cart, and then you see him being sort of given stuff and all these other things. And you start to realize that like Neil again is having this sort of kind of jab at cult leaders and how brutish this guy is, because he's in charge because he's the most brutal one, and only he has a machine gun and all this other stuff.
One that's kind of like Charlie Manson and kind of like how the hippie thing,
turned dark
into
yeah. And so there's a nice little bit there, but it's kind of missing from the film. But it's one of my favorite parts of the show is as you see them become increasingly violent, and you've seen the gangs in London. You're like, oh, this isn't just peace and love. There's a power play involved in this as well, just as there is with everything else. And so that's kind of cool.
Yeah, and that sort of fits with the religion themes as sort of like sociological messages that are interesting and make this rise above just schlock.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the space shuttle scene?
Yeah.
So at one point they deploy a space shuttle to investigate the beam, and the space shuttle is clearly very, very far from Earth, way beyond where any space. Like, it's not an interplanetary vehicle. You do know that, right? And then it happens to be caught in a beam, and I'm not really sure why any of that's in there.
There's a great line in that where it's Chuck. Is the astronaut is called Chuck something, and he says he looks back at Chuck Marshall, the American, and he looks back and says, "And there it is, the Earth, the little blue ball." And I'm like, I was thinking like, how far have you gone that you can
Well, they show
refer to the Earth?
shots, and
Yeah,
it's like
yeah,
looks like the Earth from the moon or something. Like
yeah.
you're really far. Space shuttles don't go that far. They're called orbiters.
Yeah.
I mean,
No, they're not asking you to. This is, I think, one of the weird contradictions of this is, um, it's playing in the same sand pit as the Quatermass experiment, and those kinds of things that we sort of where a shuttle will do daft things, or the limits of scientific knowledge at that time. But we've exceeded beyond those, and they still want to have those things, but they can't. And so, yeah, I agree. There's some really odd. I would even say the space station stuff at the beginning between the USSR and the US, when it comes together, and then they're like, it's falling apart, and then it just sort of disintegrates and falls apart, and you have like a little stop motion astronaut come out, and they're
mhm,
like, he's Russian, and you're like, all right, it just looks
I
weird.
get.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they say there's like 20 some dead, and like I get that it's model work, but the idea is, I wasn't really clear. So I watched the movie. I think the idea is that the aliens have somehow caused that disintegration. Um,
Hmm.
but it's not clear. I mean, it seems like it could just be incompetence on the part of
Yes.
both the Americans and the Soviets.
Well, this again is one of those things where the inconsistency is, um, later on the beam is a visual thing.
Right.
We see the beam not just on Earth when it enters our atmosphere, but through space. And they say, "Oh my God, it's like a laser beam, but it's pulsating,
And strikes the space
and it
shuttle.
strikes the space shuttle." But you don't see anything in that first thing yet. At the was it Dog Bowl and Cat Dish and Dog Dish both spot it, and they say, "Oh, but it was on another side of the Earth," and you find out it actually hit Brazil at the same
Hmm.
time. Be like, cool, but they were miles away from it. So why did the laser beam, or why did the beam affect the space station thing? So yeah, I agree. There's a whole. I don't know. I don't know is the answer, to be honest, to that one.
Okay, so
Um.
then there's a Russian scientist who
Mhm.
appears near the end to help the
Gurov.
Brits,
Yeah.
and he sort of helps Quatermass. Why does he have to be there?
Okay. He plays a much bigger part. There's a much bigger sort of like US and USSR story in the series.
Okay.
So the guy Chuck Marshall that you sort of see, he's the American commentator at the beginning, and he also goes in the shuttle at one point, and he tries to reach out to the observatory, and he has a very brief conversation. He says, Doctor Knapp, or Cap, are you there? Do you have Bernard Quatermass? He's always here.
Mhm.
So in the TV series, all that's much more extended, and you find out that Chuck Marshall actually knows Bernard Quatermass from previous missions. They've worked together as part of the British Rocket Group, so they have a connection. And when Quatermass has his rant, he says about you have this corrupt democracy versus this dictatorship, blah, blah, and they're going to find out much sooner than they expect. So when things go wrong, the Americans believe that was involved in something.
Mm.
They're like, and so Chuck comes on and says, "What did you do? Because there's people here that think that you've done something, that you know something about what's gone on." Da 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 da. Like, so there's all this kind of stuff, and you hear that the Russians have got the same information. So there's this whole thing of like, is Quatermass? And he says, "Well, no, I was just saying that you're basically a bunch of assholes and nothing to do with the spaceship." And Chuck pops up again later, and they have a much longer conversation at the thing. And again, he says, "We are working with the Russians. You will meet Gurov." And Gurov is actually introduced earlier in the TV show as part of one of the another scene in the hospital and this other stuff. So when he turns up later on and he's just like, "I'm going to make a statement," you're already aware of him. Like he's already been involved and stuff. So he is Chuck Marshall's counterpart. So you've almost got like Chuck Marshall is the astronaut for America. Gurov is the Russian equivalent of Quatermass, and then Quatermass is in the UK. So you've had these kind of little bits and pieces going on, and then he joins based on this thing of Gurov comes to the UK to saying, basically, you guys, I need your guys' help because back in Russia, they're just going to start launching rockets into space. Like they intended to launch nuclear weapons into space, but they've got no target. We don't know what they're going to do. And so, yeah, that's sort of how that comes about. But it's much more condensed in the film. It does feel like he comes out of nowhere. And they have much longer conversations as well. That fourth episode is them, and they have several conversations about the fall of society and some of the bits and pieces. And so you feel that they're actually sort of like bonding and stuff. So when Quatermass is left alone with Cap, like there's a bit of a conversation where, like, Gurov intends to stay. And that's when he says to the British general says, "Can this Russian be trusted?" And he's like, and gets all huffety about it. Quatermass is like, "Doesn't matter because he's going with you." So it kind of has much more of an impact than in the series.
He gets all huffety puffety.
He gets huffety puffety, yes.
Okay, some of that comes through in the movie, but not as much. Yeah, I mean, at least that adds another sort of like international sort of subplot, some kind of context. But I'm not sure it's entirely satisfying.
It's not. It feels rushed, even in the TV show. What's funny is the show is 3.5 hours, close to 4, I think. It's 4 sort of 50-minute episodes. And it still feels, although it feels over a longer period of time, and things have a much more like the Wembley Stadium part is much more drawn out. Like, there's much more conflict. They get chased and they go under the thing. They're shot at much more. It feels more dramatic in the TV show. And then when Quatermass comes out and he's confronted by those rent-a-cops or those bi-cops, again, like they almost kill him. Like they really are going to sort of like do him. In the film, it feels a little bit more like, "Oh, here's my papers." Like, leave me alone. So it feels much more drawn out, but then all of a sudden sort of realizes it's only got one episode left, and so it's like, oh crap, like we've got to resolve this. And so like rushes to the end with this whole silliness of like smells and other bits, and then they're like, okay, that's what we're going to do, and then we're going to launch a bomb, and you're like, oh, so it's led to this. Okay. So yeah, I think the first 3/4 of the series, even the film, I think the first 3/4 are much better than the finale. I think the finale is real sort of like, it sort of goes down like a lead balloon, in all honesty.
No, I think that's true. I mean, I think and even having watched the movie, it kind of starts slow. But I have to say that, a lot of the basic drama works. This is not a good movie, but the basic drama works. I'd say once you have the first incineration, that's clearly like the end of the first episode, that occurs like 30 minutes in. It's right at the end of Act 1 in the movie. So you're like, oh, okay. From then on, I'm not bored. And for a, TV movie from this era, that's pretty good. I mean, even with the, Papers, Please, at Wembley, yeah, it's rushed, but I'm not bored by it. I'm not like, oh, this is laughable. Now, the special effects, every time you have, when he's in the basement of Wembley Stadium and he's being chased and everybody's killed but him, and you have the light on him, I understand that's like the end of the third episode. It looks really horrible. I mean, it really looks bad.
My favorite thing, and we've literally, behind the scenes kind of thing, we've literally just been talking about Doctor Who. The most Doctor Who-ish moment for me of this whole sort of like, you talk about the budget, when he comes staggering out of the bottom of Wembley Stadium, and everything he's covered in like dust and all the powder and stuff, apart from the main parts of his face. But also, for some reason, whatever this energy beam was, only affected the end of his sleeves and trousers. Like, the end of his sleeves are all shredded and sort of like looking, but the rest of him is fine. And I was just like, oh, that's a quick. Oh, we've got to make him look disheveled. Quick, get me some scissors. We're gonna chafe up his suit a little bit. And you think like, oh, that looks silly. Like that looks really silly.
Yeah. And there's a little bit of discussion about like the trauma. Like there's that guard who says this is the worst day of my life, and you know, okay.
Well, this is that thing again where like, because he's not talking about what he's seen now.
Right.
He's talking about what he saw the night before. And again, it's one of those things of show don't tell. They can't show it. But one of the things they allude to, and it happens when him and Margaret turn up at Wembley Stadium, they're all chanting "Huffty Puffety" thingy. But there are also gunshots, and there's also a bunch of other stuff. Like people are like going nuts in there, and you find out that it's filled like 70,000 people in there, and it's filled with like the Blue Brigade, all these other gangs, all these other people, Planet people, all kinds of things. And you can hear stuff going on, but you don't hear anything. But the next morning, one of the cops, what you call them, says basically, like he said, it started with the guns, and then they started to tear each other apart. And so there was excessive violence in that place again. Like it sort of before the beam came, it fell into absolute violence in the stadium. And that's where he's going like, oh, this is no worse than the powder was what I saw last night. Like, and this is where I think it's a real missed opportunity to go in this, because this is exactly what talked about in Quatermass and the Pit. This Martian gene is about defending clan, isn't it? That's what happens at the end of that film, is like those that are non-Martian start getting rounded up and killed and stuff. And then they talk about even in the opening of the film, there's a line where it says some ancient, meaning of like this, we've degraded into this by some ancient cause or whatever or something. And you're like, okay,
it's like
cool.
The ancient sort of like evil and aggression and humanity is, has caused civilization to decay.
Yeah, and you go, okay, cool. Then why is that not? Why is that not reference to the items from Quatermass and the Pit? Surely that should be the point. So, yeah, that bothered me. That it says that, but then doesn't actually go anywhere with it. So,
well, and then you mentioned the Reds and the Blues being in the stadium together, and I would look, I would have liked to have seen that violence. But there is this horrible scene where they're firing at each other, where and let's be clear, every time a gun is fired, you just see like the actor moving the gun and a sound effect, like they're not using cap guns. There's nothing coming out of the end of those guns.
No.
And they're sort of in rubble. I mean, kudos for shooting rubble and everything, but they're sort of like, oh, all right, let's follow the Planet people. And the Crips and the Bloods put down their guns and follow the Planet people. And let's be clear, the Reds and the Blues, and just the most generic names, are, distinguished by having red or blue headbands.
Yeah, I do find that funny.
That's how you tell your side from
one
the
of them.
side.
There's a great bit actually, because they do talk about they've got red. One of them has almost what looks like a what do they call them in the suit pocket when you have this? You have like your handkerchief sticking out your suit pocket. Suit square.
Mm-hmm.
One of them's got like a red suit square. And you're like, well, that's really dignified. Like it's
very posh.
It is very posh. There's some very odd choices made in that respect. No, I agree.
I dye my martinis my gang color.
Yeah. Yes. Well, they do make fun of this because I think the very opening scene, and this is where tonally, I think this kind of skips all over the place a little bit as well. And I feel that this wasn't Neil. I think this is Hagar, the director, has elements of this. Is when Quatermass is first dropped off and the taxi's like, I'm not going any further. Like, I don't go south of the river tonight, this time of night. he gets attacked by two guys that are going to like attempting to mug him. Like, what's he got? But instead of playing them as sort of like, aggressive, what you would be a sort of typical sort of like thuggish Cockney, you geezer, what you doing? Sort of the Ray Winston kind of thing. They're both bloody from Eton. Oh, chum, look at this. Look, take his teeth. My dear sir, he's got his own teeth. Has he indeed? Well, what's in his bag? And you're like, hang on, this really is throwing me for a loop. Is this supposed to be some sort of, is this a joke? Is this are they meant to be like a posh gang? Like, I'm really confused by the opening scene. But I'm like, all right, cool. So, yeah, tonally, it has those problems throughout because it does that a few times, like the Planet People as well, where like they're massively aggressive, but they're all about peace and love, and you're like, I don't think this is how it works.
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, I think they took the mugging class at Eton.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, it is very strange. I mean, the peace and love thing. I mean, you never really get into the planet people's cult. I mean, nobody really ever stops to say this is ridiculous, but I'm going to follow this because I want food, right? For example, right, or something like that that would give us some insight into what it's like for these people or why they would join this outside of just we've depicted society's bad. They're clearly a kind of other, and
Yeah.
I think it's while I like the sociological ideas here, this is about something in a way that a lot of bad sci-fi maybe isn't. It's not, the planet people are still always an other, right?
Yes.
I mean, this is clearly from the perspective of, a grumpy old man looking at the hippies going, they just follow the leader and they're stupid.
I think, yeah. I mean, we'll wrap up on this because I think it's. I think the thing we both agree in of the four films, this is the weakest of the bunch. And as we both agree that Quatermass and the Pit is the best.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something about this I do kind of like. And I think I am biased. I'm a Quatermass fan, and I sort of I do like other Nigel Neal stuff as well. But I still feel like within these four films, I think I alluded to this when we talked about Quatermass and the Pit, that there is a story to be here. And I'm not saying I can write better than Nigel Neal, but like using his stuff as a baseline, like you could tidy this up into quite a tight continuity and do a full Quatermass saga that starts with him and him being sort of boorish and stuff, with from the Quatermass experiment, and with it ending with him sacrificing his life in some fashion, better than a 35-ton megaton bomb, to save the world. I think it could be an interesting set of stories to tell.
Or just being a bitter old man, having seen society changed and having had his optimism from the Rocket days, worn away. I think that is more interesting. Watching Quatermass in an armchair, watching news broadcasts of rioting and whatnot, saying, I did everything for this. I believed in a better humanity.
Well,
and
I want to see what drove him to Scotland. I want to see that the aftermath of Quatermass and the Pit is he kind of gets blamed for the events. I mean, as I say, in again, the difference between the film and the TV show in that sense is in the film it ends just after the crane hits the demon-looking thing above Hobbs End, and it ends there. The sort of riot becomes a bit of an end. But in the TV show, there's a follow-up where Quatermass again is on air, and he has this whole monologue about this is in us, and we're a violent species, and we've got to keep it in under control and sort of control our worst impulses. And that's where it sort of ends. And I think that would be more interesting if like he's the one that called it out and everyone's sort of it's there. Whatever triggered at Hobbs End has actually triggered a bit of a ripple, and it's going to keep growing. And that's what sort of ends up. And you could do all kinds of things. Then you could lead it to that rise in violence is actually what triggered these beams that in some respect. I'll tie it back, but I don't know. It feels that there could be a continuity there, and this should be something that could be explored, today.
Yeah, you're not wrong, and I like the cult stuff. I like the idea of these beams that people believe are taking them elsewhere, but are really disintegrating them. I mean, I need a motivation for that. I need
Yeah.
a lot of the scaffolding of a plot and a story that it doesn't quite give me. But I mean, there are things here that are redeemable and make me wish for a better version of this.
Yeah, and a better Quatermass. Andrew Keir would have been a grumpier sort of like older Andrew Keir would have been great, doing this. But I think he was too old by this point. But yeah. So that's it for our We've done the Quatermass. We've done all 4 Quatermasses. But we're not done with our apocalyptic thing. We're obviously still going on the main feed, and we've got more side stories here as well. So stick it out. We've got some cool stuff coming, and some bizarre stuff as well. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but I'm quite looking for Hell Comes to Frogtown, and always good to get some Roddy Piper.
As a 6-string samurai.
6-string samurai looks great, yeah. And on the main feed, you'll have Tank Girl and some other sort of more serious, down to earth kind of post-apocalyptic stuff as well. This isn't the end of the British TV series either. 2 that I sort of snuck in for the Patreon is Threads, which I mentioned again to someone recently, and they were like, "Okay, that's kind of depressing. Interesting what you say." And When the Wind Blows, which was it's a post-apocalyptic animation. So we've got some cool stuff coming. Interesting things to talk about.
You Brits are so hopelessly optimistic.
It's all the sunshine we get. It's all that vitamin D that we get.
I love that every American dystopia is like one man, can save it and turn the world around, and every British story is like everyone dies and it's depressing, but that's our lot.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. You're all gonna die in a nuclear winter. You go, all right. Well, yeah, it's what I expected. All right. Anyway. For now, ladies and gentlemen, Julian, thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. It was a pleasure to follow through on Quatermass.
Yes, and I'm glad we'll be able to finish it. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for your support, because obviously this is the Patreon, and we appreciate it. We really do. And we shall see you on the next episode.